to public session. Okay, thank you. We're now in public session. So just to do the usual housekeeping notes at the start. So just to remind members and witnesses to turn off their mobile phones, please. The issue of recurring overruns in health expenditure has become a key issue that exercised the committee's pre-budget discussion this year. So in July 2018, the prospect of significant overruns in the health budget were flagged to us. It was a key theme raised with the Minister for Finance at our summer meeting and in the committee's interim report, which was published in July. So following the budget 2019, both IFAC and the PBO highlighted the expenditure management in the health service as a key fiscal risk. The role of the committee is to monitor fiscal and budgetary risks and to make recommendations on how budget scrutiny can be improved. We requested the attendance from officials from the Department of Health and the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform to discuss our difficulties in scrutinising the health vote and its impact on the broader fiscal and budgetary policy. I'd like to welcome Colm Desmond, Assistant Secretary to the Department of Health, to our meeting. And just to acknowledge the fact that he has agreed to attend at short notice to accommodate this committee's request. I'd also like to put on record and note that the committee had invited the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform to contribute to the meeting. They declined this invitation, which is something the committee finds regrettable and not acceptable. The committee has noted the lack of engagement by the department. The committee has agreed that we will follow up on this with the Minister for Finance and Public Expenditure Reform at the earliest opportunity which we have. So just to note that before thing, and again to thank you, Mr. Desmond, for coming in. Can I just do the note on privilege there? So before we hear from you, Mr. Desmond, just to draw your attention to the position on privilege, wish to advise you, guest, that by virtue of Section 17(2)(1) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to the committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence on a particular matter and continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. If you are directed the only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment or criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official, either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So, Mr. Desmond, I know that you have provided us with an opening statement to the Joint Committee on this issue. You provided an open statement to our Committee on Health on this issue a few weeks ago, but I'd now like you to invite you to make a number of points to our committee before we seek to discuss the matter with you.
Thank you, Chair. And I have provided an opening statement today, which I'll read, and I apologise again for the late submission of this due to work circumstances generally. So, Chairman, I welcome the opportunity to address the Select Committee on the issue of budgetary control and oversight of the Health Committee of Health Expenditure. The committee has noted its concern at the level of persistent supplementary estimates in respect of the health vote and commented on budgetary planning in this regard. In any given year, the government has a finite amount of money for allocation in the budget and has many competing priorities. During the fiscal crisis, as with most areas of public spending, significant restrictions in health funding were experienced. Including 2014, the budget provided for health was less than that provided in the previous years, with significant targeted savings through pay reductions and efficiency. 2015 saw the first modest increase in the health vote for a number of years, but this was insufficient, given the erosion of the base funding during the financial emergency. The once-off supplementary estimate that year was required to meet ongoing running costs in the sector, new initiatives commenced during the year, and some demand-led initiatives. Thus, whilst 2016 saw a further budgetary increase, the majority of the funding merely met the existing costs within the system, along with pay rate increases. In recognition of the difficulties facing the system, the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform approved a further 500 million for health in the REV, this sum remaining in the base for 2017. This allowed for services for older people to be maintained at the previous year's levels, 30 million, met shortfalls in the State Claims Agency and PCRS in the range of 200 million, and provided for a winter initiative of 40 million that year. Additional funding of 450 million was provided into the 2017 budget, along with a further supplementary estimate of 195 million. Of the original funding, 39% was required for pay rate and pension costs, with a further 6% supporting the State Claims Agency. In relation to the supplementary estimate for that year, 38% or 75 million related to the acceleration of the restoration of pay under the Lansdowne Road Agreement, with a further 25% or 50 million required for the State Claims Agency. For 2018, the Government approved gross expenditure of €15.332 billion for health services, €14.839 billion for current funding and €493 million for capital funding, representing a 4.9% increase on the original vote budget for 2017. For 2018, 45% of the additional funding provided in the budget was required for pay restoration, resulting in very modest increase for services and the consequent need for a further supplementary estimate. When account is taken of pay restoration, costs associated with the State Claims Agency and other demand-led areas, there is a reason for the level of increased expenditure year on year. Furthermore, the nature of the health services is such that the normal budget management levers available to other sectors, such as reduction of services, are simply not available to us, and consequently overruns can and do occur. External factors such as the actions of the private health insurers can also drive the need for additional funding. In his recent presentation of the 2018 supplementary estimate to the Select Committee on Health and Children, Minister Daly welcomed the significant additional funding for the health sector in 2018 of €655 million, of which €625 million is towards overspends in current expenditure in various areas of the HSE. The Minister of State acknowledged that while the amount of the supplementary estimate is significant, it represents less than 4.3% of the overall health expenditure in 2018. Minister Daly also noted that, despite the significant increases of recent years, the issue of health funding remains a major challenge, not just in Ireland but internationally. Dealing with a growing and ageing population, more acute health and social care requirements, increased demand for new and existing drugs, and the rising cost of health technology will all continue to pose a financial challenge into the future. The annual health budget is set within the parameters set out by the Government in its approach to planning for the annual budget. The improving economy has enabled the health service to achieve much-needed budget increases in each of the last 3 years. It is also clear that there are areas where further improvements are required, and the Department will continue to work with the HSE to optimise service provision within the constraints of available funding. In relation to budget management and health sector planning, extensive planning and performance management processes are in place. The HSE publishes performance profiles on a quarterly basis and separate management data reports for each month. There is a monthly performance management cycle both within the HSE under its performance accountability framework and between the Department of Health and the HSE. The HSE's Performance and Accountability Framework operates under a National Performance Oversight Group, which has delegated authority from the Director-General to scrutinise the performance of the health service provider organisations, in particular hospital groups, community healthcare organisations, the National Ambulance Service, Primary Care Reimbursement Service and other national services, to assess performance against the National Service Plan. Despite, therefore, in conclusion, welcome increases in the health budget over recent years, a financial challenge remains as we deal with a larger and older population with more acute health and social care requirements, increased demand for new and existing drugs and the rising costs of health technology. The costs of payments under the State Claims Agency are also rising, adding to the overall cost of health above the operational costs funded to meet the health demands of a growing and ageing population. These challenges reinforce the need for good budgetary management and control, a focus on improving the way in which services are organised and delivered, and on reducing costs, all of which aim to maximise the ability of the health services to respond to growing needs. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, and thank you very much for those opening remarks. Now I have a number of deputies indicating that they wish, so the first to indicate to me was Deputy O'Brien.
Yeah, just a couple of brief questions. Just in relation to this year, is it likely we're going to need a supplementary estimate to the supplementary estimate?
The supplementary estimate is what has been provided by the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform and has been welcomed by the Minister for Finance. And we are monitoring very carefully the evolution of expenditure this year, and we are hopeful that we will be able to manage within that.
How hopeful?
That is our objective.
Okay. Just in relation to the supplementary estimate, we get a breakdown in relation to it and where it's been spent. And most of it is going to the HSE regions and other health agencies, and it gives us a pretty detailed breakdown in relation to it. One of the things that it states is that this was not to fund any additional activity, but to maintain the current number of levels. If this is the case, if any of the additional allocation is due to an increased but unexpected demand, what performance indicators are being put in place in terms of outputs? So, for instance, I mean, I would imagine if there's a demand in an acute hospital setting, it has knock-on effects right across the system. So, I'm just wondering how you actually, when you're looking at your supplementary estimate and you get your figure, do you take into account likely increases that may result in increasing funding into one setting? So, for instance, if it goes into an acute hospital setting, would it not likely also increase the number of inpatient and day cases, discharges? So is there a knock-on effect?
The evolution of acute spending, which is essentially what you're referring to, is monitored throughout the year, and it certainly is one of those areas that has, along with other areas that you'll be aware of, proven to be an area which has tended to overrun. And therefore, it is considered both in its detailed components that you've described and in its overall composite form. And it is interrogated by the HSE centrally as part of the performance framework that I've described to you, and by the department in its engagement with the HSE on whether a supplementary estimate should actually be provided or sought. It's in that basis that the performance indicators do indicate, when the service plan is established at the beginning of the year, what the likely evolution of spending will be. But it isn't always the case that the various components of the acute sector, for example, can remain within that area due to particular circumstances. The winter planning, the winter issues and Storm Emma, for example, did have an impact this year on the acute sector of a significant nature.
Okay, here's the issue I have. If we're doing monthly monitoring of the budgets, is essentially what you're telling us, that we monitor it from month to month. Yet, I mean, up to a week before the budget, we couldn't even get an answer from either the Minister for Health or the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform in what the likely supplementary estimate would be. I mean, to me that indicates that if they don't know what it is there a reason why they don't know it if we're doing monthly monitoring?
There is, of its nature, Deputy, a certain lag in the reporting, and it will be not literally at the point in time because of the scale of what is required in terms of compiling information from a very diverse system of hospital system, for example, which is what you're referring to. However, I mean, the department was aware, and the HSE was aware and signalled relatively early on in the year that there were pressures emerging. So from that point of view, it was more a question, I would imagine, that a specific figure may not have been available at that point in time.
But the question, and that's why I asked that the very first question was, are we going to need an additional supplementary? Because it's very hard to have confidence in even the supplementary estimate that was passed, whether that's going to be enough, considering there is such a lag, as you put it. I mean, surely there is a better way of pinning this stuff down.
Well, in fairness, the supplementary estimate, when it is agreed with the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform and his officials, is based on the estimate of what we feel the position will be required for the year in full. But it is not an exact science, but it is at least the best estimate at that point in time. So the objective will be to remain within that estimate as much as possible.
And where are we right about now, so in relation to that?
Well, we have a supplementary estimate of the amount that I mentioned, 625 in relation to current, and that has a number of components, including the acute sector, and it would be our objective to manage within that. However, it is not entirely an exact science, but it is, we would hope, the range within which the HSE should come in at the end of the year.
Thank you very much. Deputy McGrath.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to welcome Mr. Desmond and thank you for the opening statement. Can I just start by maybe asking you to set out how the process works for setting the budget for the Department of Health and more particularly the HSE, because I think we have to go to the the origin of this issue, which happens, quite frequently, supplementary estimates in the Department of Health. So can you just take us through how it works? The HSE makes an ask or a request of the Department of Health. The Department of Health is engaging with the Department of Finance, Public Expenditure, and at the end of the process, can there still be a significant difference, but the figure is set at a certain amount? Can you just take us through the process?
Well, the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform, Deputy, would set out in the late spring summer period the approach he would be taking to budgetary parameters overall, and that gives an indication to all departments as to where exactly they will see the scope for managing within the existing allocation and for planning for the year ahead. And therefore planning for the budgetary allocation is guided by that from the beginning. The HSE is invited to submit its bids, as you say, and the department and the HSE then engage in the late spring summer period in a very detailed engagement to interrogate the actual application by the HSE and all the different components of it, right across all the sectors, including workforce, pensions, pay, and all the different components. The Department of Health will then, having interrogated the HSE thoroughly in that, engage with the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, and HSE officials are available and participate on the detail with PER officials in relation to determining the real basis upon which the demand stands, and that will usually arrive at a quantum which is agreed is the requirement for the health sector, or at least what the health sector, through the Minister and the officials on his behalf, seeks from Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform. But as with all departments, the demand is invariably greater than what is available from the global amount available to the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform under his budgetary parameters, and therefore it is a question of discussion and negotiation in the period leading up to the budget as to how the department's budget is allocated for the year.
Yeah, but wouldn't it be fair to say that in the case of health, it is lastminute.com. It comes down to the very dying days of budget preparation, and I'd have some small insight into that by virtue of the confidence and supply agreement that we have. But health always seems to be the last piece of the jigsaw that fits into place, and there is very, very late contact between health, public expenditure, and the HSE in settling at the final figure. Yep.
May I just, Chair, agree to one extent that it is a very significant budget. It's one of the biggest in government. So it is a challenging budget for everybody to settle, not least for the Minister for Health and the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform. But I can reassure the Deputy that the engagement commences very early on and is in parallel with all of the government departments' engagement with the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform officials, and it is very detailed. It is a very significant range of programme areas, and so of its nature it requires a fair degree of interrogation. This year it was well known as well that we had an emerging overrun, which was in fairness significant, and that added to the level of detail that had to be engaged with.
But I mean, the reason why I'm probing about how the budget is set in the first place is to seek to establish how predictable it was that there would be a significant overrun. So did the HSE, through their ask in spring, summer 2017, and then right into the eve of the budget in 2017, predict that they were going to need in the region of €600 to €700 million extra, even on a standstill basis? I mean, there has to be a reason why this keeps happening in one department. So how predictable was it? And looking ahead into 2019, is it again the case that there's a big gulf between what the HSE is saying they need to provide health services on the one hand and what they have been given in the budget on the other hand?
In relation to 2019, the HSE will shortly formally submit its service plan to the Minister, and that will form the basis of the HSE's view on how it will spend the allocation that has been provided by the Government. In relation to 2018, we engage in regular monthly monitoring and performance reporting with the HSE right from the beginning of the year on a monthly basis, as I described in the statement. So it stands to reason that we would be monitoring and taking account of the evolution of the major spending areas within the HSE. So that's, that is the process that we have. So it would signal to us that there are areas where there are pressure points. Some of them are performance related, some are outside our control, such as state claims, other areas like that.
But I mean, yeah, I accept that, but to put it in another way, like what is the gap between what the HSE asks for and what the HSE ultimately gets by way of their budget? What I'm trying to establish is, you know, how predictable all of this actually is, that it's going to happen year on year until we somehow manage to get those two to marry.
Well, the budget is set based each year on what is available and is agreed by the Minister for Public Expenditure Reform, Minister for Health. Therefore, the 2018 budget was as agreed in Budget 2018 a year ago, and therefore the health sector is required to manage within that, but that regrettably did not prove to be the case, and it has been a feature in recent years, but for varying reasons that I did set out in my statement. It is a feature of an area which is under a fair degree of demographic pressure. That's not a reason that there shouldn't be interrogation of the reasons for that sort of pressure. Yeah. And it is an area where there are other factors, such as pressure in disability, older persons and other areas that you'll be aware of, which are very clear from the demand across the health service.
I have two other questions, Chair. One relates to the accounting and reporting dimensions of this. So when you look at the Exchequer returns to Fiscal Monitor for the end of September, I think the overrun in health comes in around 300 million, and yet the supplementary estimate at the end for the full year is 655 million. So can you inform us, how is it that 3/4 of the way through the year the reported deficit in health was about 300 million, and yet it ends up at more than double that for the full year, which only had 3 months left to go? I mean, somebody mentioned to me that it was because that the figures reported every month in the Fiscal Monitor, the Exchequer returns, are cash-based, whereas in health there are bills building up that are not yet paid. Can you take us through exactly how that works? Because, you know, we were hearing about hundreds of millions of a supplementary estimate, but yet when I was cross-checking that to the Exchequer returns, I wasn't seeing the same scale, and yet that is where it ended up.
There are components, certainly the HSE operates on an income and expenditure basis, there are components which would not be reported through the evolution of the major programme budgets, that is true. There would therefore be also a time lag that I described in terms of what September would report may well have been slightly earlier. There may have been a degree of delay in that. It might be more useful if I could provide a more detailed paper on the different components of how that accountability and reporting actually operates. If I could offer that, certainly could provide that to the Deputy. But I think it was certainly a time lag in the programme areas.
But I mean, from the point of view of budgetary control, budgetary management, from the point of view of this committee in the course of its work throughout the year, if at the end of September, those figures are published at the beginning of October, we see in health an overrun on the current side of 301 million, and yet the overrun is coming in at, was it the current side at 625, is it?
Well, that is the supplementary.
So, I mean, you've given some explanation there for it, the income and expenditure manner in which the HSE manages its money, and then the time lag for the recognition of some expenditure. But, you know, from the point of view of this committee trying to track health expenditure, like, the information published every month is useless because it was so wide of the mark.
There are some components such as state claims agency expenditure, the income issue around the private health insurance and such that are more difficult to predict at that stage in the year. So they would have a bearing on it, certainly. But I do agree that it would be more satisfactory if there was a more composite collection of data reported at that point. Okay,
final question. Just projecting into the future. So how many years into the future is the Department of Health now predicting health expenditure?
Well, the Department really, through its research function and the HSE itself, really would project as far as it can in terms of demographic trends. But in effect, we do operate a cash-based system on a year-on-year basis. I suppose it's reasonable to say, Deputy, that we'd be projecting 3 years ahead on the main programmes, in line with the general accepted approach for all government expenditure.
But I mean, the budget documentation published by the Department of Finance would set out projections now for 5 years, so to the end of 2023, including expenditure projections. So presumably the Department of Health has fed into that.
Yes.
So where I'm going to with this is the point made by the Fiscal Advisory Council about how credible and realistic the expenditure projections are, particularly in health. I mean, we're all aware as practising politicians about the pressures, the demographic changes that are happening and the impact that that's having on nursing home care, care for the elderly, disability services and so on. Huge pressures, and people are thankfully living longer, but that is having a very direct impact. So to what extent are the figures that the department has for the next 3 to 5 year horizon realistic and based on, you know, a proper assessment of the demands that are known to be there over that time?
It's very desirable that they should be, as you say. They're certainly set very firmly for the area of capital spending under the National Development Plan, for instance, up to 2022, with 2023 to be firmed up. But under the whole 10-year plan, there is quite a bit of planning ahead for that. In relation to current expenditure, it's a little bit more difficult to project. And on the other hand, it also has to take account of what is realistically available to us over the next period of time. But it would certainly be a factor that we would be looking ahead over those periods that you say.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Lahart.
Chair, and thanks, Mr. Desmond, for your public service. Thanks for attending. A number of questions. Just you outline on page 4 of your presentation there a number of agencies and interventions that are designed to assist you with budget management and health sector planning. The management data reports, performance profiles, performance accountability framework, etc., etc. A National Performance Oversight Group. So when someone discovers we need more money, we're short on a budget for this, who ultimately makes the decision to spend that money without, in the full knowledge that this is bringing you into overrun on your budget?
The department wouldn't allow any overspending outside of what takes place without it being agreed that perhaps it is a demand-led area where it is difficult. For instance, you cannot refuse, for instance, demand in relation to the primary care reimbursement service of the GMS in relation to reimbursement for certain drugs, high-tech drugs, and if there is simply, such as with the adverse weather last year, just increased demand for emergency department or other acute hospital beds. These are all issues which confer an entitlement on the health service user, and therefore they would be flagged as they begin to emerge during this performance reporting process, and there would be interrogation as to the basis for it, how real was it, and then perhaps
after the fact, is it?
Well, as it becomes available, as the information becomes available, it certainly.
But as the information becomes available, the money has been spent.
Well, the HSE does have to meet certain demands which an individual service user or client or any person is entitled to avail of, and that will have an effect on whether the funding is made available to that particular service within the HSE or that particular organisation, yes.
Not always in relation to home care packages.
The HSE does manage the budget it has in relation to home care packages as best it can to meet the demand that is coming towards it, but it certainly does have a challenge in relation to the overall budget that it must operate within and the genuine entitlement of those who are entitled to it. Therefore, it is required to manage that as best it can throughout the year. If pressure does begin to emerge, then it inevitably will manifest itself in the process that's described here.
You pardon my chuckling, because now you're distinguishing, we'll say, between things like primary care and home care packages. And I'm saying, who makes that call within the Department of Health? Who decides, well, actually, home care packages, that budget, we need to exceed it because there's a really critical demand. And home care packages, not only do they save the state a considerable amount of money, you know, there is an acute need for them, and that can be demonstrated quite clearly. But you mentioned, for example, you know, that would be scrutinised live. But there are others, like the ones that you outlined, primary care, etc., the money spent before it comes before the review committee, so the review committee is looking at it after the fact.
Well, I wouldn't be making the distinction perhaps as strongly as perhaps it may have come across. It's a very, very broad range of services provided across a huge budget every year. Therefore, inevitably, pressures will begin to emerge in a number of points during the year. The HSE will indicate to corresponding department officials if it feels there are pressures emerging, and then it will become more definitive through the performance reporting process that I've described to you here. There will of course be interrogation by the Department of the HSE and indeed by HSE senior management of the different programme areas within the Health Service Executive, which covers, as you know, a vast range of services, as to the basis upon which a particular budget is under pressure. Yep. So I wouldn't like, Deputy, to take the view that one is more preferential to the other, because we haven't got into the detail of each particular area to that extent, in fairness.
Thank God, I think, to some degree. But who makes the decision?
Well, in certain areas, it is simply a question that entitlement drives the demand, and the demand drives the cost. Primary care, GMS, for example, budgetary issues, reimbursement. In other areas where persons are entitled to a service, then there is a budget to be managed, but there is also a point, I would imagine, where it becomes challenging for the HSE.
No, I accept all that.
Yeah,
but
so that is the point then, at which...
I know that, but it must come across somebody's desk to approve that entitlement.
Well, it certainly does come across a manager's desk at the appropriate level, but it would be difficult for me to say specifically where and at what level.
But who gives the manager then the approval?
Well, under each individual directorate in the HSE, they would have the responsibility for monitoring the spend in their areas throughout the year, and if it's a case that pressure comes on a particular budget, then the issue will be elevated through the process I describe, and there would be
elevated where?
To the more national level.
Which is what?
Well, it will be at the national directorate level in the HSE in terms of the particular
And they make
areas.
the decision there?
And they would, but that would be a matter in terms of the detail of that would have to be put to the executive directly, but that would be where the decision would be taken.
But there isn't an executive, is there?
I mean, if they were present here today, sorry, Deputy.
All right, okay. So, now the question you mentioned, or the point you make about health being particularly complex, like education's pretty complex. Social protection is very complex, the range of schemes it has and the variations that are going on all the time. Hard to predict, I would imagine, the social protection at the beginning of the year, how many people are going to come on to disability benefit, how many will leave the live register, how many might come on the live register, and then all the plethora of schemes that only very few in this House really understand, but they don't have the kind of overruns that health experiences.
It is a fact actually that there are supplementary estimates in the education and social protection.
Very modest.
In any event, but
they are. You will acknowledge that.
I would have to quote statistics on that, but that wouldn't be fair, perhaps. But they are still relatively. They can be significant amounts of money in the overall.
Nothing like health.
We can give some information on that, perhaps, but maybe it's
no. But I mean that's
appropriate to say so.
Yeah.
They have been in the range in other departments of around 1 to 3%, for example. Social protection is lower, as you say, and health has been relatively higher, yes.
So that's my point. No, but that's my point, Mr. Desmond, that these are complex departments with complex budgets and complex challenges. Now, you're acknowledging that the overruns there aren't as significant as health, so we'll park that. What is it about health?
Well,
I mean, I hope you. I mean, I'm just talking as a public representative. To follow on from what my colleagues have said, there's just this consistent overrun. So, what accounts for it in health?
Well, I think the health sector does have a large range of interconnected services, which perhaps make it more challenging to actually manage across.
Can you back that with evidence? Because I'll accept it if you can, that the budget in health is more challenging, more complex than the budgets that they have to manage in education and social protection. Or are you just
the services
surmising?
are of their nature complex. In fairness, I wouldn't comment on the other departments.
No, but you're suggesting that by virtue of the complexity of these services, it makes the budget a little bit more challenging than, say, if you're dealing with education or social protection. That's my point.
It does, to the extent that we have a number of intersecting areas. Apart from the acute area of primary care, community care, you have a lack of capacity in the latter. You have therefore a lot of pressure on the acute sector, and all of these have individual budgeted areas, and all these budgeted areas are managed within those component areas, and that does bring a degree of complexity that I think we would consider right across the health sector is very challenging. Perhaps that is a factor compared to the other departments you mentioned, but in fairness, I could not comment on those departments.
Yeah, but you actually did, you see. You said health has more complex challenges than other departments. Now, we've got your background to the point where actually you don't know that for sure. You're surmising it, and it may be the case, but you're surmising. The final point I want to make, and thanks for the latitude, I think the Parliamentary Budget Office, see, I suppose we would always have thought these big supplementary budgets for health, that they're caused by a drain in one particular area. It might be the drug scheme, or it might be hospital beds or something like that, or primary care. But the drilling down the Budget Office has done suggests that the supplementary estimate required this year is actually spread pretty evenly across the entire health system, about 5%. That there's no big chunk going into one area over another area. So what does that tell us?
It tells us that there is significant demand in a large number of service areas, some more than others. Disability is a good example. The acute sector that I mentioned. It shows that there are some areas that are outside of our control, such as State Claims Agency and others that are listed in the supplementary.
No, but it's 5% right across, so there's there isn't a particular spike, as I understand it, in State Claims Agency. There's actually a kind of an average 5% right across the whole.
When you say right across, Deputy, just to clarify, that the supplementary is spread across all of the service areas?
The increase is spread right across, yeah.
I might clarify that by providing some information on the detail of the supplementary, but it may not be as evenly spread as that. We have, in fairness, identified some areas of the budget, such as the mental health budget, which is close on 800–900 million this year, which has not seen the need for additional funding. We have areas such as disability that certainly has, home care packages certainly has, acute certainly has, but there are other areas again, such as corporate within the HSE that have, but other areas that have not, in fairness. So that just, maybe I'm not understanding the point exactly, but it's spread widely across the health sector, but not specifically that widely, if I may say.
It would be great if you could forward them, and thanks for coming in today. Appreciate it. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Ryan.
Very much appreciate the presentation. Can I just set it in a slightly longer context? I was saying this earlier on in our discussion on another issue, but if you take a 15–20 year perspective, my understanding is our health budget just in the year 2000, including both private and public health spend, was about 6.4 billion. That jumped, which is hard to believe the scale of the jump, in 2007 to 15.7 billion. And in the 2013, where I understand, Mr. Desmond, your analysis kind of started, you know, even though there had been a significant, obviously, curtailment of the budget, as you said, because pay and or other constrictions, it was still, the figures I have there, just referencing it, was 18.4 billion. And now we're up to, well, with the estimate this year, I guess it must be guts of 21 billion this year, if you include the estimate, the increased revised estimate at the end of the year. I just make that point because it does seem that the correlation between spending and outcome, it's very hard to see. You know, we weren't starting from a low base in 2013 where you started. You know, we started at a base which had dramatically increased in the previous 10–15 years. You know, there'd been a huge increase in spending. It wasn't as if we'd gone all the way back to 2000, nothing like it. And I just say that because it's important in terms of us, I suppose, in the Budget Oversight Committee have a concern about effective spending of public funds. you could say, oh, all the problem is because, 2013 there was a contraction in the budget, paid rates of services. But that was in a budget where there had been a huge increase in the previous 10 or 15 years. Do you understand the point I'm trying to make? Or do you think there is a relevance in those, that sort of timeline? How is it we survived in 2000 on a budget of £6.5 billion?
In relation to a budget that combines public and private, they're not figures I have. The figures I quoted in the statement are the public spending figures. In relation to 2013, I think there had been tight budgets in the years immediately up to that, because the whole fiscal piece had begun to hit 2010, 2011. It is a significant increase over a period of time, Deputy. I agree with you, but it may well be the factor on the cost of services, and we would have to look at international comparisons to see whether we were particularly out of sync in that regard.
That's very, very true. And I was looking there just briefly at the statistics as I could find them, in terms of if you compare us with the OECD on spending per capita, which I think is the best way, because spending as a percentage of GDP is very, in Ireland's case, is such a distorted figure because of the nature of our GDP. But if you look at spending per capita, my understanding is we are a third above the OECD average. We're seventh highest in the OECD at 4,000. Today's figure, I think, was €4,706 per annum per capita spending. Is that a fair assessment of where we are within in international comparators?
At the last committee on the 24th of October, the Joint Committee on Health, we had clarified that the OECD has placed us fifth in terms of the EU 28.
Okay, but that's still very high up.
In per capita terms, so the interpretation can vary.
Yeah.
Within that, there can be quite significant variations in how that is measured compared to other countries. There's this old perennial issue of whether we are including social care, whereas it may not be within the health sector in other societies. So there's also, whether that is actually a factor. Also, there are within that particular areas which are particularly difficult, such as the number of doctors per population is considerably lower here, and the number of beds actually is lower, and yet we have a significant acute budget, for example. So there are issues there in terms of ED and other pressures which may be contributing.
This might assist the policy makers, because if, as you say, we're the fifth highest in Europe, and that's a very high level of spending per capita, given the wealth of kind of other Europeans, a lot of our European colleagues. And if that's in the teeth of a environment where we've very low numbers of doctors, where you'd expect that you think we'd have the fifth highest number of doctors if we're fifth highest budget per spend. And also, if you look at the fact that in demographics, while you cite that, yes, we're being challenged by demographics in terms of increasing population, the reality is in comparison to what other European countries, we have absolutely clearly a much younger population profile, which should see us having a much lower health spend. The bulk of health spend comes in the latter years, and therefore in countries we're comparing with have a profile of a much higher percentage. So given our very low numbers of doctors per capita, given our very high spend per capita, given our very low youth age per capita, all those figures would be pointing you to say, why is it that that we have a policy problem in how we're spending our money? Would it not?
We have actually a shift towards an ageing population, which we're seeing pressure on. That's coming through in terms of the GMS schemes, in terms of the home helps, the older person's budgets, for example. I agree that there are issues in relation to the analysis, but it is comparison that is difficult to judge and bears a good deal more research. I think there is a general overall demographic increase due to population increase. I think we are seeing the ageing population beginning to have an impact on the overall budget, and it's not going to decrease. And I think we're also seeing very high occupancy within the hospital system, upwards of 94%, compared to 77% in other European 28 countries. And so we have significant pressure there, and significant pressure there due to the lack of appropriate community and primary care services which might relieve that. So there's a number of factors in there that might complicate the analysis.
You'd expect then the reaction to that would be a significant increase in the capital expenditure, but that's not where the revised estimate has been by and large. You mentioned the areas of the state claims, the demographics or whatever. If it was coming if the supplementary was coming because we were increasing our capital expenditure to address some of those, what are undoubted critical shortfalls in our system, you'd say we're on the right path. But if we're just plugging the gap and not actually seeing capital expenditure kick in, that would raise side for concerns as well.
It would, but in fact, capital is significant because the range in the last 10 years has been, and we spent a total of about 4 to 5 billion over the next 10 years, and the process has started with the NDP. We have 10.9 billion to spend, and a lot of planning to get into place for the second half of the National Development Plan. So, I mean, the capital piece is entirely recognised as something that needs significant attention, and the Department of Health is, and the HSE are gearing up for that. But I agree with you, the capital infrastructure investment has not been at the level that it should have been in recent years, no, without a doubt. And it's, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank all the members. Obviously, due to some commitments, some of the members couldn't remain. I have some questions, just and comments, just to finish up. First of all, can I again begin by thanking you for coming into us, because you had and showed the respect to our committee to turn up, unlike the officials in Deeper. The government announced in 2018, October 2018, a new budget oversight group to be established, which will include officials from the aforementioned Deeper, who still don't think therefore they should come to us, which is interesting because they'll be involved in this budget oversight group, the Department of Health, obviously, and the Health Service Executive. The purpose of the new body will be to monitor and control health spending and staffing within budget allocation. Now, I just put one thing to you. There's a couple of things I'd like to put to you, but one thing on that, and that ties directly into, in the 2018 National Service Plan, right, there was a financial challenge of 347 million at the beginning of 2018. How much of the savings were achieved to address the financial challenge? And to what extent, and I appreciate you're obviously looking at stuff there, to what extent is the supplementary estimate for 2018 a result of not meeting that financial challenge? Now, the interesting thing is, you mentioned already about the work plan for 2019. Is there going to be a financial challenge in the work in 2019? So, if there is, and allowing for your historic inability to meet that challenge over many years, are you effectively conceding, or will you concede, that any mention of a financial challenge in that 2019 plan is effectively the announcement of what will crystallise as a supplementary estimate for 2019?
Chair, we can't foresee what way 2019 will evolve in that regard, but we are awaiting the formal submission of the HSE's National Service Plan, which the Minister will then consider in regard to...
When is that due?
Imminently.
Imminently being days, weeks?
Well, it is the intention that it should be published before the end of the year, so certainly it is therefore pretty urgent and is in process.
And is there a financial challenge in it?
Well, the budget that was achieved includes the benefit of the supplementary has gone into the base for 2019, plus the additional funding provided by the Minister of Public Expenditure and Reform, and therefore Minister Harris has welcomed that as a very significant allocation for the health sector, and the HSE is framing its service plan in that context. So it is clearly, that is the position we are in at this point.
There's no question it is a very significant, because it has gone into the base, and so therefore it would be very worrying to see at the outset of the year any potential that would link to the possibility of an overrun. I want to go back to something one of my colleagues was mentioning to you earlier on, which is, you know, where does it come from? Where does this overrun come from? And Deputy Lahart wasn't, he was making reference to the 5%. Indeed, in actual fact, having looked at these figures here to you, which I've put to you, the one most remarkable consistent management, strategic management by the department is their ability to overrun to roughly exactly the same amount. So the HSE Dublin and Mid-Leinster, 5%, HSE Dublin and North East, 5%, HSE South, 5%, HSE West, 5%, grants to health bodies, 5%, and building and equipment 5%. And we had a blip in what's a quite small head actually on the payments to state claims agency of 17%. But that does seem to indicate an absolute, almost, I'd say nearly a consistent disregard of trying to reach target. That every single one of those heads, 5%.
Well, without looking at the detail of those, there's no doubt that budgets were challenged, as I explained in the opening statement, for a long number of years in terms of the base they were starting from. Therefore, with the demographic demand that began to appear roughly in parallel, it therefore certainly, led to a view that if, you actually met the budget, but if you came close to meeting the budget, that was considered acceptable performance, perhaps. Now, that is not actually obviously acceptable in any circumstance, but with significantly increased resources, our view is that we do need to see these managed within the overall allocation, and I think the Fiscal Advisory Council consider that a hard budget constraint, for example. So we therefore need to continuously look to see how resources like that can be managed more effectively. So if the trend is there, the trend merits examination, and that is part of the performance and accountability process and the financial examination process I described. So that is something you have reasonably identified and will be a key issue for the HSE in 2019.
Well, it certainly is a key issue, because I appreciate taking one line out of an opening statement is sometimes a bit unfair, but I would put it to you because I have a real problem with it. Furthermore, you say the nature of health service is that normal budget management levers available to other sectors, such as reduction of services, are simply not available to it, and consequently overruns can and do occur. Now, I'd put it to you that if we had anybody in from any department, they'd probably like to be able to use a line like that. You can actually manage within a budget if you choose to. And when you see, in my opinion, the consistency of an overrun right across so many areas, it strikes me that just the operating practice was to manage it, that there would just be an overrun. That there wasn't actually the normal type of operational management structures in place. Because to put it to you in the other context of the department versus other departments, and what percentage difference in 4% or 1% or 2% or whatever, let's look at the type of the heavy hitters here for a second. So health, 655 of an overrun. The next big heavy hitting department is social protection, 139. Their budget is 10,627, health is 14,871. There's a huge difference between that. Education and skills, 181. So while you can juggle around on, 1% or 4% or whatever, it is a very, very substantial overrun, which seems to occur due to a complete lack, as far as I can see, of an ability to control or predict expenditure accurately. Because the one thing that consistently seems to come across to us is that in the early part of the year, the expenditure overrun seems to be relatively modest. It then seems to go effectively out of control in the latter part of the year. Now, if that happened once, you'd say, right, something went wrong there. But when that happens almost every year, and I think on some of the tables I saw, almost the exact same pattern of lack of control happened in 4 consecutive years, surely somebody is capable of making a decision and saying, right, we need to redo how we look at this expenditure.
I couldn't disagree with you in any way, Deputy. I think it is a matter that is a serious concern for the health sector, absolutely. I think that it is a complex sector with very mixed quality of data available and very mixed quality of financial and other systems to assist us in the job that we have to do. All of these issues contribute to actually ascertaining where the expenditure is actually, the funds are actually spent and in the manner in which they are. It varies considerably across the services. but it is far from being the perfect situation in terms of the structures that are there to monitor expenditure and to keep it under control. There is absolutely nobody would disagree that the matter requires serious consideration. And I was explaining there about how we do need to move to a continuous monitoring to a greater extent that actually yields us the information and the control that we need as soon as it is actually manifesting itself. Perhaps we would hope the integrated care organisations will mean that management will be more accountable in a more decentralised structure, and that could only be of benefit to us, which would mean that financial problems should be addressed rather than being passed up as, you know, here's another thing that we can't deal with, you have to deal with. And therefore, giving that degree of scope to local organisations in an integrated structure, we would hope will assist in the level of responsibility and, in fairness, the level of capacity that would be accorded to managing budgets there. But to
Are you
mention as
confident
well,
that that level of management expertise should now be there, particularly dealing with the increased budget which is now available to them?
well, we certainly would encourage that it should be the level of monitoring and control should be at the most appropriate level, and it certainly should facilitate the best budgetary management that we can get. It is a journey, in fairness, but we would hope that it certainly is part of a wide-scale reform that is going on financial reform within the health service executive.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because my view on it is that without that change, without that fundamental change, to borrow an analogy that's used a lot about speed limits in this country, there's supposed to be a guidance to where you stop, not a target to aim for. Because if you aim for the target, you will overshoot. And therefore, if there isn't that mindset change, no matter how big you'd make the health budget, as far as I can see, you'd end up with a management structure that's currently there, overrunning it by 5%, because it's almost inherent in the way things have been done to date. So I do hope that that change in thinking permeates right down into the delivery of the service. I'm conscious time-wise, I'm going to have to draw it to a conclusion. Now, I would like to thank you very much for the time you've given our committee today, and to all the members on all the answers. I think it has been a very informative exchange, so thank you very much. And now, just in conclusion, we've no further business. We will conclude our proceedings, so our meeting now stands adjourned. Sine die. Thank you.